Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome Facebook Live. Hello to Google Hangouts. Hello if you're on Twitter. Hashtag GenWhyNot is the Twitter handle. My name is Femi OK. This is part 2 of a Women Deliver Al Jazeera English Facebook Live series about young leaders around the world. We are looking at the power that young leaders have and what their work that they're doing and the impact that they're having as well. I'm going to say hello to Melissa Fairey. Hello, Melissa.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's really good to have you here. Melissa, the first time I had a conversation with you, you dropped the F-bomb within seconds. I was like, Melissa, tell me about yourself. And she went, boom. Tell me what the F word is and why it is so incredibly important to you.
So the first thing that I describe myself in a lot of settings is I'm a feminist. And this approach is how I look at politics, how I look at engagement, how I look at the world around me from a feminist lens. And not just a feminist, but intersectional. So including race, gender, and social injustices in all the frameworks that I look through.
So Melissa Fairey is our Women Deliver Young Leader for the next 30 minutes. If you have a question for her, send it to us and we will try and put that in our conversation as well. Melissa, how else do you describe yourself? That is what you believe in. That is what drives you. What do you actually do?
So I'm a community development worker. I'm a sexual reproductive health advocate, and I'm a community engaged citizen, which includes a politically active global citizen.
When did you know that you were politically active?
So when I became politically active is kind of different than what the global standard of a politically engaged citizen is. We often hear about adulthood being when you turn 18 or when you're 30. I knew that I was politically engaged from a very young age because I was engaged in the world around me. I noticed injustices in schools, in the community that I lived in, and that to me is an important distinction around what politics is.
So that moment where you first exercise your power, you could go out there and vote. Tell us about that day.
Mm-hmm. So I was 18 and it was during a provincial election. And I was so excited spending the months leading up to it around understanding politics and understanding the enormity of a vote and something that isn't truly exercised globally and doesn't have a lot of, it's a privilege. The very first time I went to vote, I went with my younger sister, who's 10 years younger than me. And this is important when we're talking about future generations of political engagement. I voted for the candidate that I wanted, and the people who were running the booth said to her, who was at the time, she was 8, would you like to put the vote into the ballot on behalf of her? And I thought at the time, what a remarkable thing to engage the next generation of young people that isn't so often done. And it has led her to being a really engaged political citizen in her life because of that first moment where she felt I was engaged in a system, even though I didn't have the specific power and privilege to put that vote on the cast. So my first time voting was, I think, just as important to me, but also to my younger sister, who's a part of a different generation of voting.
Melissa, if we're really honest, there are going to be some times where people just literally just turn off from politics, not even young people in particular, but anybody. It's like, I do not have an appetite for this. Politicians are annoying, they're dishonest, they never deliver. What's your pushback to that?
So my pushback to that is speaking to the institutional idea of politics, so engaging with political leaders. But I very much go by my values and beliefs around politics, the quote by Ai Weiwei, where he said, everything is art and everything is politics. You engaging with people in your community group, creating a sustainable project, speaking informally with somebody at a restaurant about what is going on in the world around you is politics. You can't turn off from politics. And I think even the idea that you can is a very privileged idea. If you are a person living in the United States who is a Muslim under the travel ban, your very existence is political. And you don't have the privilege of turning that off. So I think the idea of I can turn off politics, I can stop talking about it, is not something that is representative of society and the laws and policies that govern us. And I don't think it's a privilege afforded to very many that they can stop being political.
We momentarily lost our connection, Melissa. So the world disconnected from us from a little bit, and now we're connected back up again. So I'm just going to say hello. Thank you for sticking around through that little technical glitch. This is part 2 of our hashtag Gen Why Not conversation with young leaders from around the world, particularly young leaders in the Women Deliver Young Leaders program. Talking to Melissa Fairey. She is talking politics, and she's telling us why politics is so incredibly important and engaging younger people. For instance, I voted when I was 18, Melissa. Anything wrong with that? First time I voted.
I think, and this is a radical perspective, Austin, but I think 18 is too old to start voting. I would give young people voting as young as 14, 15, 16. And this is always seen as a radical view, but I don't see that it is. I don't know how when you turn 30 or when you turn 35, suddenly you become an actively engaged citizen and you're suddenly able to make decisions that govern. If we gave young people who are 14, 15, 16 the voting right to power, institutionally and in our education system, we would provide them with the tools to meet that responsibility. I think part of the problem why young people aren't engaging at 18 or after is because all of a sudden they have this power that's never been engaged. They've never been given the opportunity to step. And by lowering it, we actually make young people a part of it and young people's voices. That ties very strongly to the phrase you often hear where young people are the future. And I go against that because young people are present. And by lowering that voting age from 18, I think that's an important first step to that.
Joyce Banda is the former leader of Malawi, and she once said, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu.
Absolutely.
I get a feeling that you're trying to get young people all sitting around the table so they're not having little bites taken out of them. Tell us about social media, tell us about this, tell us about that, but not truly being engaged. How do you change that and stop young people from being used as window dressing? I've seen that so many times. So you have a big conference and there, but the day before there'd be a youth conference. And it's like, it's something separate. It's like the little table, the kids table, and then the big table. How do you get youth onto the main table? Give us some examples.
You know, I don't just want young people at the table. I want them to be at the head of the table.
Ooh.
So I think having young
Melissa, you want a 14-year-old running things?
I don't say necessarily a 14-year-old, but I want a young person. So somebody under 30 who has the merit and the opportunities and the ideas and policies that can change and make this world better. By enacting.
All right, I'm gonna nitpick here. Policies like what?
So feminist policies. So we have examples. We could even look in Canada at Justin Trudeau. His feminist policies that take an inclusive framework of engaging young women in their sexual reproductive health, allowing women to make those choices. That is a feminist policy that I would approach for young people in politics. And I don't necessarily think somebody who is in their 50s and 60s would necessarily enact. So if we're having young people in politics, I think we are looking up to new knowledge, new ideas that is so necessary in a system that is not representative and inclusive.
Justin Trudeau.
Yes.
Picture of him with some young people and you. Tell us about this picture.
So this picture was taken, it's a selfie, first of all, which I'll come back to later, is very important. But it was taken at a town hall discussion hosted by Maclean's magazine, where he invited young people from across the country to ask questions on social media and in person about engaging young people. This photo and many of his other photos have gotten slack in the media for selfies and including young people in slacktivism and not having young people truly represented as a way to actually mark change. And I go against that. I think selfies and activism are a way to engage young people, and they're meeting them in their social space.
Ooh, all right. Okay. So selfies are activism because how and why? Because
visibility. One of the biggest things we have in political engagement is not representing inclusive demographics. If you see photos of yourself with a prime minister, if you see photos of yourself with political leaders, photos of yourself is representation. A selfie of yourself at the Women's March is representing yourself in that space. And I think that is something that has been undervalued in social media and also with young people.
I want to talk about not social media, but something that you've actually done that have changed people's lives when
Yes.
you were at the age where people probably didn't think you had much to contribute.
Yes.
Tell me about what happened in Georgia.
Yes.
And this is not Georgia, Atlanta, by the way. This is Georgia in Europe.
I get that a lot, actually. So I was in Georgia in Eastern Europe working with the Georgian Ministry of Education. I was a community development worker. And part of that involved living in a town of about 200, 250. And going into that school, I realized that in the older the ages, the less young girls I saw in the classes. And I kind of asked around social demographics, is there a reason why? How come these girls are not staying? And it had largely to do with women's role in the household, but also young marriage. So in order to curb that, I was a part of working with another member in the community, creating a project where young girls could be engaged through media arts and creating stories, videos, poster campaigns that demonstrated why they need to be in school. Now, this was important, and it's a political act, even though it's not in institutions, because we're engaging young women in a community at a local level. They are staying in school, they're staying a part of those policies, part of those institutions because of their voice and their say.
So Melissa, I'm just trying to think of you in this school.
Yes.
And then you're coming in and talking about activism, but I don't think I'm hearing real conversations that you had.
Yes.
Tell me the real conversations you had. I feel like you're telling me the polished TEDx version, and I want the raw version.
Yes. So this conversation started from me being in the 7th grade class. And I looked at them and I said around, what does it want to be when you grow up? That's a really basic question that you could ask anyone around the world. And I think it's what, adults and parents ask children. So I said to one girl in particular, what is it that you dream of being? What is your goals when you grow up? And she initially said a doctor, but kind of backtracked and said that she couldn't afford these dreams and these dreams couldn't be a reality. And that to me is a very pivotal moment that talks about young women in particular's role and how basic human rights and education are not something that is afforded to everyone. It's very much a privilege. So that conversation and that young girl saying, I can't afford my dreams, I can't afford to go to school, I can't afford to be a doctor, was a very pivotal moment in that project, and everything spiraled from there.
If I went back then now, if I went back to Georgia now, would I still see a little imprint of your activism there?
Yeah. Yeah, and that is a really important part of activism, that the project outlives you. I have always attributed any project success to sustainability, and that project is still there, and it's still run by people in the community who are raising those girls, who are a part of that and their success going forward. So yes, it is still there, and it's something I'm super proud of, and I think it's something that young people can do in a way in other communities outside of their own and in their own that makes change and isn't damaging.
You're listening to Melissa Fairey. Melissa Fairey is a young leader with the Women Deliver Young Leaders program. This is part 2 in our series of #GenWhyNot. Use that #GenWhyNot, because if you want to talk to Melissa a little bit later in the next 15 or so minutes, you can be in a Twitter chat with her as well. Send us your questions. You can put them at the bottom of the page for Facebook Live, on the Google Hangout. So many ways that you can be part of this conversation as well. Something, Melissa, you sent me caught my eye. Mm-hmm. Nothing can happen for young people without them. Not only did it catch my eye, you also sent me an image of that. Mm-hmm. Tell me about this image that we're about to see. Why is it important?
So I was in a youth conference, which you mentioned, kind of the tokenability of young people in youth conferences, where the slogan was "Nothing for us without us." And in politics, I don't know how you can change how young people, or especially young women, policies without them being involved. An example, Women's Day was on Wednesday. I went to, yes, March 8th, and I went to a conference where out of the 3 speakers, 2 of them were white males. And I think even then, in regards to changing women's views, how are we doing that when we're putting the spotlight on men or on people that aren't actually representative of that community.
All right. So I am a feminist too. You cannot change the world if you just clap with one hand, right?
Yeah.
So let's say this hand is women, this hand is men. Don't you have to do that, right?
Yes.
As
absolutely.
opposed to, so what were the men on the stage saying? Or were you just annoyed that they were on the stage?
Maybe a little bit of both, but
right, okay.
in order to clap with two hands, I think that's a great analogy, because they were mentioning about the solidarity of working with women, and that is great, but 364 other days of the year. I think there's an importance of solidarity and allyship, but in holding space for people who are actually representative of women of color, of trans women. If we don't actually amplify those voices, then I don't know that those voices get heard. It's like telling the story. The story is important because who it comes from.
I am thinking about prejudice and stereotypes of people watching perhaps you, watching other young leaders and just thinking, what do they know? They don't know anything. You'll learn when you're older. There are instances where you've been in a situation where you are in charge of people who are 30 years older than you. Set the scene. Tell us how you deal with something like that.
So I have an example of the devaluation of young people, because I think that's kind of what you're going towards. So
I like that devaluation of young people. I just think I call it as like being dissed. Right?
Yeah.
And tell me everything, including the looks and the comments, because I want us to go there.
Absolutely. So the first big thing, and this is a really formative moment when I was like, I think young people are not respected in the workplace. So I was working for an organization that I had been with for over a year. I was in a supervisory capacity with people older than me, younger than me, different positions than me. The head of the organization and CEO was introducing me to another staff member and said, "This is Melissa, who's our student intern." And not to devalue student interns, but I was in a position of supervising and manager capacity and contribute to the organization in ways that the head of the organization should have been aware of. And it was a really important light bulb moment where I was like, okay, are we just having young people at that table so that they can they be there? Can we check a box that says, okay, we've hired a young person, versus are we valuing young people? So that's why I say a seat at the table versus head at the table. It's not enough to have a seat at the table now, because that is not enough. It's not enough power. It's not enough progress. It's not inclusive enough. So I think that's important.
Melissa, when you were introduced as the intern, what did your face do?
You know, I think back in hindsight of all the things that you would say, and my face, I'm sure, dropped, but I didn't say anything to correct.
Why not?
And I think back to that, and I think a lot to being a young woman in a space where in that moment I did not feel like I belonged. And I think that imposter syndrome of being a young person, especially being a young woman in positions of power, is a really important thing to look at. And if we link it back to even politics, are we electing women, and are we being like validating them in politics, giving them that power? And I think back to that moment a lot of, all the things I would have said being a strong feminist woman, but in that moment,
let's do a do-over here. Okay, so Mr. Fairey, hello. This is Melissa Fairey.
Yes.
She's at Say what?
Yes. I would say, actually, I'm a supervisor, and I have contributed to this organization in inclusive, beneficial ways.
All right, so let's talk actual pragmatic advice and tips for young people who feel that they want to change the world, push the status quo. Walk us through it. What can you do?
So I think my first part of tip is for young people themselves. So young people to recognize your capabilities and your passions. Find other leaders to connect with. The Women Deliver Young Leader program is a great example of young people combining on sexual reproductive health. Mobilizing in communities, attend protests, organize protests, rallies. Don't be scared of institutions. I am currently a protege with the City of Toronto Councillor McMahon, where we pair young women with with female councillors to create community projects. ways for young women to be engaged in institutions. And I think on the flip side, just as importantly as the onus is on young people to be engaged in politics, we need to have institutional changes. So organizations that meet young people in their own spaces, engage social media, digital media.
Right, so let's slow down here for people who are actually thinking, I want to do this. I'm paying attention to Melissa. Let's take them one by one and unpack them and give us an example of how this is happening or how it is not happening.
Sure.
Which is actually more educational.
Yeah, so an example is youth conferences and youth councils. So that actually, an example is happening this week at the United Nations Status of Women, where they're having a pre-youth conference. I think get rid of youth conferences altogether, or make it so that it's a conference on merit. Engage young people by merit of basis of their engagement versus just separating and segregating. I think this is an important discrimination in terms of ageism that makes young people only valuable in relation to other young people, where young people are valuable as a whole.
What about myths about youth and politics? They don't vote, they don't care, they're just taking selfies.
Just taking selfies. Yeah, and we are taking selfies, and I hope we continue to take selfies. But that is a huge myth of apathy. And it's an easy scapegoat, I think, for previous generations to blame the generation that came before. And I think it's happened all throughout history. But if you look at the biggest political issues in our time so far, Brexit and the election of the US, young people voted the opposite of the outcome, which is very important and very hopeful, I think, as a young person to look and see what young people are doing and deciding on their future. I just don't think we have the time to wait till they become old politically engaged citizens to make those changes.
Sometimes I feel uncomfortable about even saying young people, because I think of people, I think of just them as people, and I feel like it categorizes you and then makes you something separate from mainstream. Is there a better way to think about youth and the power and the potential that they have?
So I think, yes, I think saying young people is segregating and different, but I think in this position where we're talking about inclusivity and representation, it's the only way we can do it at this point. I also don't know that you become 30 and you're no longer a young person. Why is young person? Yeah, like, am I going to turn 30 and be like, now I'm just a regular engaged citizen? No.
Yeah.
I think if we look at young as more of like a state of mind and an ideology, I hope I always have these same beliefs regardless of when I'm 40, 50, 60. And I hope I still identify as a young person. And I think that's important as well.
What's the quality that you think you need to have? If somebody is watching you and thinking, I would like to do what Melissa is doing. She's bold and confident, and she thinks she should be at the head of the table, not even just at the table. What are those qualities that you need to have?
So I think one of the biggest thing that you can look at young leaders making change, and especially from different generations, they're troublemakers. And they're rebels, and they have these.
Yeah.
They have these radical views.
I was trying to think of how to say that politely about you, because I'm listening to you. I'm just like, she's just trouble, but that's not a bad thing, right?
No, and I think being a troublemaker and being rebellious and radical to a system is, on the flip side, being an innovator. So come up with new ideas. Come up with ways that you can change the political system. The way that we have right now is not enough. If you do a Google search, so this is something for the audience that they can do. Google search political leaders. Tell me how many pages you have to go through before you see a woman.
Ooh.
Then tell me how many pages you have to go through before you see a woman of color, and then seeing young people. So that full page is filled with men. They're not our political leaders, and they don't represent me, and they don't represent communities that I'm from. So be an innovator and a troublemaker, and don't be afraid to be. I think some of the best people in the world have been troublemakers. So I stand by that in the political realm.
Owning this quality that you have, what is the most trouble you've ever made?
Oh, goodness.
Of course.
So the most trouble, I think, just speaking out. I'm not afraid to use feminism. I'm not afraid to say the word abortion. I'm not afraid to say sexual reproductive health. That has been in a lot of spaces, especially growing up in a system where Catholic school is very prominent. Saying abortion and sex, I think, has led to a lot of my political engagement in the issues that I care about. And I think that vocalization of what I believe in is important and a huge tip for young people.
I have a question
Finding
here
what you're
from Milan.
Sure.
Question says, how can we educate kids on critical thinking so that they can vote well?
That's a great question. Critical thinking, I think, is so important in politics, because you have to challenge the media, and that's what everybody looks to for educating them. So say we go back to my mythical world of 14, 15, 16-year-olds voting. By giving them the whole picture and identifying issues that affect them and their community. So I think of when I was young. When I was young, because I grew up in a family that was pro-sexual health, I had those open discussions around sexual reproductive health, around abortion, around contraception. I think having that same openness to any political issue is important, especially for young people. We talk to children, and kind of as they grow up being young, with this and this lens of trying to shelter them. And again, that idea that all of a sudden you'll be 18 or 25 or 30 and somehow be ready for the world around you. That's not the case. And you can only do that through preparation. So I think preparing them with frank and honest discussions is so important. And thank you for that question. That was great.
Yeah, it's a good question. More questions that you can ask when we take Melissa, and we're going to put her on Twitter, and the hashtag for the Twitter questions, make sure you have them, all of your questions with hashtag Jen, why not? And Melissa's going to say an extra 15 minutes. She's going to be 15 minutes later for work so that she can actually answer your Twitter questions about the political activism, the engagement that she actually does. Something that caught the headlines on International Women's Day was a headline about a lot of money from Canada's PM. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I'm going to show the headline, and you can tell me your thoughts when you saw this news.
The first thing I felt was pride, and then second was renewed hope. I think everyone knows this is in response to the global gag rule by the President of the United States, which pulled reproductive health funding. I thought this was a remarkable step, a feminist perspective that was enacted from the leader of a country and a global leader. That influences people, children, youth, young people, adults, political citizens, and says this is okay, which is important for you to see in a leader. That it is okay to be a part of supporting sexual reproductive health, and it is okay to speak out and be a feminist. He's made feminism not a dirty word. He's almost made it cool to be a feminist.
Almost.
Almost.
What is he like? I mean, you've been in the same room with as Justin Trudeau, so you kind of know whether there's a difference between the branding, the myth of the man, and the reality of the man. What's he really like?
So again, back to critical thinking, which is important. He is great for making feminism conversations happen. He's great for inviting young people in. He's the Minister of Youth, which is great. But we still have issues in Canada of our Indigenous women being missing and murdered, and there has not been enough to address that. And being in the same room in him, he has definitely made space for young people, but he has not made it inclusive of all demographics in Canada and abroad.
Work to be done. Okay,
and there's always work to be done. So
yeah,
absolutely.
All right, if I was going to commit a single act of activism today or this week, this weekend, that might have an impact on the world, putting you on the spot here, Melissa, what can we do in the Hangout, in the Facebook Live, and people who are following on Twitter? What would you say that we can do?
So I would say the first thing, it goes back to the trouble and the innovator, is to look at what you're passionate about and start educating yourself about it. None of this engagement or being a political citizen can happen without the education. Find a community group, something in your local community. Get your friends together, get the women you care about together, and start talking about these problems that you face and the problems that your community faces. Nothing can happen at a local, international, or country level without having conversations. And that doesn't, that's on social media too, in digital media. information and resources have to spread. And I think having that first conversation is such an important spark.
Melissa Fairey is a Women Deliver young leader. She likes to mobilize young people. She has a passion about that. She cares about sexual health and reproductive rights, and she's also a community developer for youth as well. She's also available to you on Twitter for the next 15 minutes, #JenWhyNot, and you can keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching on Facebook Live. Thanks for watching on the Google Hangouts. Melissa Fairey, thanks for being here. It's always good to talk to a fellow troublemaker. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.